This is ILTV on the hour, bringing you the biggest stories from Israel and the Middle East. I'm Shosh Bedrosian, and today is day 634 of the war in Gaza. Let's get into all the top headlines at this hour. Developing news, Prime Minister Netanyahu is now set to visit the White House and meet President Trump amid Washington's efforts to end the war in Gaza. Netanyahu and his cabinet will be joining. The pressure is mounting for Israel to secure a ceasefire deal and release the 50 hostages that are still in captivity at this time, as Trump works to create peace in the region. As he says, more countries are now interested in joining the Abraham Accords after the ceasefire between Iran and Israel was established. And we also are learning at this time that Netanyahu is actually confirming this visit. This is an update that we're getting in right now, saying he will be flying. He'll be meeting with Trump, confirming he will also be meeting with Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff as well. He says he will also meet with senior lawmakers, too. There are sharp differences, reports with Minister Smotrich and Ben-Gvir reportedly opposing the end of the war without the total defeat and removal of Hamas. And the trip to Washington will be Netanyahu's third time since Trump's return to the office in January, and will come 2 weeks after Israel and Iran agreed on a U.S.-brokered ceasefire after a 12-day air war with Iran. Before the announcement of Netanyahu's visit to Washington, the White House press secretary said the following.
This administration is in constant communication with Israeli leadership, and the president himself speaks frequently, as you know, to Prime Minister Netanyahu. But this has been a priority for the president since he took office, to end this brutal war in Gaza. It is because of this president that humanitarian aid is being brought into the region. It's heartbreaking to see the images that have come out from both Israel and Gaza throughout this war, and the president wants to see it end. He wants to save lives. And however, the main priority for the president also remains to bring all of the hostages home out of Gaza.
And we know that 2 Americans are still in captivity, Omar Nutra and Itai Khan. And a U.S. official told the Times of Israel that top issues on the agenda would be Gaza and Iran, stressing Trump's desire to end the war in Gaza and release the remaining hostages. Israel-Syria relations will also be discussed. And Netanyahu and IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir have made recent statements suggesting that Israel is getting closer to agreeing to the end of the 20-month-long war against Hamas inside of Gaza. And U.S. President Donald Trump issued an executive order yesterday ending the Syrian sanctions program. The move came as Israeli officials now confirm that Jerusalem is in advanced talks for a deal to end hostilities with Syria. President Trump's decision to end these types of sanctions follows his meeting last month in Saudi Arabia with the new Syrian leader, and shows that Washington's move was to show its support for Syria to continue in a positive direction. Here's what the White House press secretary also said about this yesterday.
This is in an effort to promote and support the country's path to stability and peace. The order will remove sanctions on Syria while maintaining sanctions on the former President Assad, his associates, human rights abusers, drug traffickers, persons linked to chemical weapons activities, ISIS and their affiliates, and Iranian proxies. And this is, again, an action that the president promised and shocked the world with in Saudi Arabia, because he's committed to supporting a Syria that is stable, unified, and at peace with itself and its neighbors.
And it is day 634 of the war inside of Gaza. And amid speculation about a possible ceasefire in the coming days, the IDF ground and air operations have been intensifying. That's for sure. We know that they have been targeting tunnels inside of Gaza. The IDF has been operating in Khan Yunis. IDF engineers destroyed a 2-kilometer-long Hamas tunnel located underneath a former school. And the army located a terror hideout and eliminated threats in joint ground and air operations, according to the IDF. Now, the tunnel was about 20 meters deep and was used by Hamas as a hideout for military preparations. The Army says that in recent weeks, the Armored Brigade, in coordination with the Air Force, dismantled hundreds of military sites from both the ground and the air, located weapons, and eliminated dozens of terrorist gunmen. And now we're talking about an elderly victim in the Boulder, Colorado firebombing attack at a hostage protest has now died of her wounds. This happened about a month ago. Take a look at the image on your screen. This is Karen Diamond. She was 82 years old. And like we said before, she was with those marchers for the Israeli hostages. That is now turning into a possible death penalty case. An Egyptian-born man, Mohammed Sabri Soliman, is charged with the attack after authorities say he threw Molotov cocktails into the crowd in what many called an act of anti-Semitism. Diamond's death prompted the Boulder district attorney to file new charges of first-degree murder. Colorado abolished the death penalty in 2020, but federal prosecutors say under President Trump, they could seek the death penalty for Soliman. He is already charged with hate crimes for the June 1st attack, which called attention to growing anti-Semitic rhetoric and violence in the United States. And now moving on to what is happening here inside of the Knesset in Israel, there are efforts to remove a member of Knesset. Odeh, the Knesset could be taking the rare decision to remove an elected member of the Knesset. The Knesset actually has a House committee which approved a proposal to oust Ayman Odeh by a 14-2 vote with backing from coalition members and opposition parties, including National Unity, Yisrael, and Yesh Atid. The dismissal proposal will be brought to the Knesset within 3 weeks, where a majority of 90 members of Knesset will be required to finalize his removal. At issue in the impeachment effort was a statement that he made earlier this year equating Israeli hostages held in Gaza by terrorists with Palestinian security prisoners held by Israelis inside the prisons here. Odeh also refuses to recognize Hamas and Hezbollah as terror organizations. The Knesset's legal advisor has told lawmakers that this is real doubt whether the statements by him actually seizes to the level of some support for terror. And joining us now to discuss is Avi. Avi, can you hear me? Avi Melamed, are you with me?
Yes, Shoshka, I can hear you.
Amazing. Thanks so much for being with us. I first want to talk about just what's happening when it comes to Netanyahu visiting the White House. This would be his third time doing so since President Trump took office in January. What significance does something like this hold? What does it mean?
I think it's very significant, particularly when you look at it from the perspectives of the timing. We are now post-Israeli war. We have heard very strong statements by President Trump, who is expecting to move towards the conclusion of the war in Gaza Strip. And it seems like that from every possible perspective, Netanyahu's visit to the States has to result in the end of the day, some real breakthrough towards the concluding of the war in Gaza. So the issue here is not only the fact that this is the third visit, but particularly the timing of that visit.
Mm-hmm. Talk to me. Do you think that the two of them could reach a deal inside of Gaza? Could this be tangible? Could something actually come of this meeting? And if something does come of this meeting, how long will it take for it to actually go into place, you think?
Well, the major issue in the end of the day is Netanyahu has to go back to Israel, and he has his government. And as you mentioned before, the ultra-national right-wing components of the government, namely Smotrich and Ben Gvir, are opposing any kind of deal to end the war in Gaza Strip. As you may know, the government, Netanyahu's government, is actually dependent upon the support of these two factors. Up until now, it was very clear that Netanyahu did not move towards such a deal because of the concern that the government will fall down. However, at this point, I think that the pressure on Netanyahu is increasing, and I think that Netanyahu, in the end of the day, will have to come back and come forward with some sort of something more tangible than rhetoric, because on the other side of the line is President Trump, and President Trump was already making it very clear that he's running out of patience. He's expecting this whole issue to be beyond us. And so I think that Netanyahu will have to make some strong, clear decisions, whether he wants to try to keep his government at all costs, including a collision with President Trump, and, of course, increasing criticism within Israeli public opinion, or is he going to move forward towards some sort of like an agreement or an arrangement in Gaza Strip? My assessment is this is his inclination, and I think that he will move towards that path.
And in terms of, I mean, you mentioned Ben Gvir and Smotrich's comments right there, just in terms of, not wanting to leave the Gaza Strip until Hamas is fully dismantled. Other than military occupation inside of Gaza, what are likely scenarios that could come together for a deal in Gaza that would be acceptable for all Israeli officials at this point?
Again, when you are talking about Smotrich and Ben Gvir, they are hanging on to this slogan, the ultimate defeat of Hamas, which is not a realistic objective. It was never a realistic objective. They are coming from the ultranational right wing. They have now an unprecedented power, which is totally disproportional to their power or proportion in the political system. And they are trying to monetize and exhaust that influence capacity to the best way they can do. But in the end of the day, it has to be emphasized time and again, Hamas is not going to disappear. And the whole slogans of eliminating Hamas and Hamas is going to be obliterated, these are slogans that are mostly compelling maybe some of the political parties in Israel or some of the political segments in Israel, but this is not a realistic objective. In the end of the day, as I've been saying since day one, the whole objective realistically should be to create conditions and framework an environment where Hamas' ability to continue and to dictate its radical agenda as it was unfortunately able to do in the last couple of decades, that ability should be restrained tremendously, significantly. There are today different conditions and circumstances that can make this objective tangible and achievable. But cleaning or sticking to slogans that are not tangible and they are not achievable, the meaning of that is one and only one, and that is the continuation of the situation with the increasing concern for the fate of the Israeli hostages in Gaza Strip.
I want to ask you specifically about the hostages. Analysts have been continuing to say that Gaza, Hamas inside of Gaza continues to have power because they are holding onto these hostages. Is it realistic that they will go on in the near future and really agree to this ceasefire deal if holding on to hostages gives them power? By agreeing to a deal that would release the hostages, don't they feel as if they'll lose the power that they have?
Well, there are different aspects to that when you try to look at Hamas' position. Hamas launched October 7 attack under some sort of like premises and underlying concept. And basically what happened since then was that Hamas is finding itself in an increasing dire situation. He is under a lot of pressure, both internally within the Palestinians as well as in the Arab world, who hold Hamas, rightly so, accountable for the disaster in Gaza Strip. Hamas, as I said before, is not going to disappear, but Hamas needs to recalculate its course, and particularly right now following the Israeli-Iran war, the defeat of Iran in this war, and particularly the way it has been reflected in the region, obviously deepens Hamas' dire situation and inner pressures within Hamas. Now, the big question is, in the end of the day, whether Hamas will be able to walk out from this whole situation in a way that it could claim some sort of like an achievement to maybe try to justify what he has caused to his own brothers and sisters in Gaza Strip. As far as Hamas is concerned, there are two major things that Hamas could try to exhaust. One is, as you said, the issue of the hostages, and the other thing is the trying to market itself as the factor that was holding on for a long period of time against the Israeli, as it's being described in the Arab world, the Israeli war machine. These are the two major things I would say Hamas is trying to monetize. But again, if we come to the situation when President Trump says very specifically a deal that brings back all the hostages and ending the war in Gaza Strip, in the end of the day, the Arab mediators, namely Qatar particularly, will have to find a way to convince Hamas or to put pressure on Hamas or to force Hamas to have such a deal. But again, it goes back to what I said before. This is the most significant thing. Hamas is not going to disappear. It's going to maintain presence within the Palestinian arena. The big question, of course, in that regard, is mostly in the context of what will be the inner Palestinian discussion vis-a-vis Hamas' path and trajectory. Hamas has been marketing all those decades the concept of the armed resistance, and many Palestinians comply and apply and support that. The big question is now, following everything that happened since October 7, and particularly what happened in Gaza Strip, the big question is what's going to be the impact on the inner Palestinian discussion. Is it going to result in a reconfiguration of the Palestinian political map, in a sense that Hamas will be to a large extent restrained? Or maybe it's going to result in the opposite process. This is currently an open question, but this is, in my view, one of the most significant questions that we need to follow and watch very closely, trying to understand the trajectory ahead.
Ask you about Iran. There are contradicting reports out there about what's next. Now, Iran is indicating that it will renew enrichment, while President Trump is declaring that Iran's nuclear program is dead and there is nothing to talk about. What is and should be Israel's view on this?
Well, as you probably know, there is some unclarity regarding the exact outcome of the attacks on the Iranian nuclear sites. It seems like on and all, when we try to assess through the different reports, some of the reports are contradicting, but it seems all in all that there has been some significant damage caused to the Iranian nuclear project, but it has not, I don't think that we could say that it has been obliterated. I think that would be an exaggeration.
Right.
From the Israeli perspective, I would say that Israel obviously has to follow very closely the behavior of the mullah's regime in Tehran following the war in couple of major perspectives. One, to see, of course, if there is an attempt of the Iranians to resume pursuing nuclear capacities. The other thing is the Iranian missile program, to see whether there is a jump or a restart or acceleration of that program. And the third thing, which is also significant, is to follow to see whether the Iranian regime will try to rehabilitate and reestablish their damaged arms, namely Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and particularly Hezbollah, that has been significantly damaged in the war with Israel. These are the three major components of what I call the Iranian triangle of deterrence that has been significantly compromised. And one of the big questions, of course, is to see whether the Iranians are going to try and to re-establish their collapsed deterrence, either through each and every one of those three legs that I mentioned before, or separately or combined. This is something that I'm sure that Israeli intelligence will be following very, very closely.
Avi Melamed, Strategic Affairs Analyst, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Shosh.
Of course. And now, as we continue to learn more developments about Netanyahu's coming up visit to Washington, D.C., to discuss all of it is ILTV's Maayan Hoffman, executive editor here and strategist. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
First off, how significant is this visit to the White House for Netanyahu? We know it's the third time, but just from your reporting, you've been covering this for a very long time. But when you see a president for the third time in just about, I believe, 9 months, even less, since President Trump took office, going back to the White House, what does that indicate to us?
Well, certainly what it does indicate is that there is certainly no daylight between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. President Donald Trump, despite reports that we've seen to the contrary. We know that the two are working very closely in coordination and collaboration. As we know, Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer is there right now holding meetings about several similar subjects, and Netanyahu will, of course, go next week. So what it says is that the other thing it says is that President Donald Trump is extremely focused right now on the Middle East. Obviously, we're 2 weeks out by the time Netanyahu gets there from the ceasefire with Iran. There's a big push to get some kind of ceasefire and hostage deal in Gaza. There's talks with Syria. There's talks that happened just right before the Iran war, if you recall, in the Gulf area with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia. And Trump is hoping to be able to achieve a lot of his goals in the area, clearly within his first year in office.
You mentioned Israel's Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, being inside of the United States right now, also at the White House meeting with officials. What step is taken while he's there before Netanyahu gets there next week? Of course, there must be some type of coordination, things that are spoken about now before the Prime Minister arrives. What do you think some of those topics might be that he's trying to iron out? Is it based on a priority list at this current moment?
Look, I think the main topic, of course, is going to be follow-up on Iran, but the main topic that we're hearing about is what's going to be with the Gaza Strip and with the ceasefire with Hamas. We still have 50 hostages in Gaza. Dermer needs is the ears of Netanyahu. He has the ear of Netanyahu. He has the eyes and ears of Netanyahu, and he's delivering the messages on his behalf, setting the stage for Netanyahu's visit. You have to remember that we've had 2 meetings just in the last few days here in the government to try to decide what we want to do with regards to the ceasefire. The last meeting failed to come to any conclusions. There's another meeting set for Thursday. The government does not agree on whether or not we should agree to the hostage for ceasefire deal. There's 3 different ideas on the table that the government is thinking about, maybe more, but 3 core. Okay, the number 1 is that we should immediately take some hostage for ceasefire deal, get the 50 hostages home, 20 who we believe are alive, another group that we believe, that we know are dead, and 2 that we're not sure about. And then we can, potentially move to phase 2, which is what Trump is pushing for, which would completely end the war. There's also an interim proposal, right? The idea that we would sign some temporary ceasefire, potentially 60 days. Many members of the government say, okay, we want the hostages as a priority. We will do that, but we don't want to move our troops out. Remember, Israel right now occupies close to 75% of the Gaza Strip. That is something that we've been working on strategically since mid-March. If we would pull back for 60 days, meaning remove our troops from the Gaza Strip, that would set us back tremendously and potentially give Hamas the ability to regroup and move forward with attacking Israel in the future. The 3 goals of the war to eradicate Hamas politically and militarily, to remove the threat of Gaza on our southern border, and of course to get the hostages home. Now, the third option on the table, and this is what some of the more far-right ministers feel, for example, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich just last night, he said, absolutely not, we can't sign any ceasefire, we need to annihilate Hamas. And do remember that Hamas is a terrorist organization. So if we leave Hamas in power, that sends an incredibly strong message to the region that a rogue terrorist regime can be. We are a world power. We just did an incredibly strategic job in Iran. We've squashed a lot of Hezbollah. We've been strong against the Houthis. How can we not manage to finish Hamas? It sends a very scary message to the neighborhood. And of course, you have to ask, will the residents of southern Israel go back if we leave Hamas in power? So the question is, what are we going to do with that ceasefire agreement?
Right. And we know that the majority of those Gaza envelope communities actually just got approval this week to start moving back. People trying to restart their lives after the horrible things that they had to endure after October 7th. You specifically talk about Hamas, and if there is time for them to regroup, it seems as if they'll take it. Now, Maayan, you've done some reporting about this topic in particular. I want to ask you, why is it that Israel has such a grip on Iran, something they've been studying for 20 years? They say that their operations were a complete success inside of Iran, but a much smaller terror organization right inside of Israel within itself is something that they cannot seem to win at this point. Why is that? Why is it a harder grip for Israel to defeat Hamas in this current war?
Well, there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, the first and foremost, of course, is the hostages that we just discussed. Israel has from the beginning been holding out and staying out of certain areas, neighborhoods, because they have intelligence that the hostages are being held there, and they of course want to be careful not to, God forbid, kill any of the 20 alive hostages or have Hamas kill them, because they know that we are coming, as we saw with what we call the Golden Six, that included Israeli hostage Hirsch Goldberg. In addition to that, you're talking about an urban area. The tunnel network underground is hundreds of kilometers long. Hamas has been building it, reinforcing it with concrete, holding their weapons down. And so this is not a regular war where our general, Air Force or some of the other weaponry, the sophisticated weaponry that we have, is not effective in those tunnel networks. Remember that there's been a huge issue, and especially under the former Biden administration, but in general, with international condemnation of the war, we have been feeding Hamas, providing aid. There is no other country in the world that has ever been asked to go to war with an enemy and at the same time provide them with food, water, electricity, etc. So as we continue to do that, we've of course kept Hamas essentially alive throughout, throughout this whole situation. We're also need to talk about, the goals. So when you went into Iran or you went into to fight Hezbollah, you had very specific military goals. But here it's not just a military goal. As I just mentioned, we have 3 goals, and one of them is political, meaning we want to dismantle the government. At the same time, there is not an actual government right in Gaza. When you talk about Lebanon, you have a partner who can help us. I don't know if they'll be effective. We don't know yet. That's to be seen. Lebanon certainly wants to try to keep Hezbollah out of power. Most of Lebanon is not followers of Hezbollah. There's one, but the other 2/3, of course, are either Christians or are other Muslims that are not interested in the terrorist organization. The other aspect you have to remember is October 7th. October 7th tremendously impacted the Israeli psyche. And so it's not a revenge mission, but people are, wanting to go to the end. People can't return to the South as a result. And so the weight is really heavy, on the Israeli people. I mean, there are a number of other reasons, but it's really not a comparable war. In the beginning, people compared the Gaza war to the 6-Day War, to the Yom Kippur War. But the truth of the matter is those were wars, again, against states, not against terrorist organizations. This is a very different war. The rules of war are different. And as a result, we are seeing a different war. And I guess the last thing that I would say is that it's been almost 21 months. But on the other hand, over those 21 months, until really mid-March, and not even, because as you saw, we were attacking Iran just a few weeks ago, we have been fighting on a number of fronts, right? We call it a 7-front war. And it is true that we started to go in and to tackle Hamas, and then we got diverted to the north, to Hezbollah. Now Iran, we heard with the Houthis. So the hope is that now, assuming we don't stop the war, and based on what we've seen, also rescuing again 8 hostage bodies just in the last few months, that Israel will be able to complete its goal and eliminate Hamas.
Right, rescuing those hostages. Netanyahu actually made that comment just yesterday or the day before. Instead of using that word release, he used the word rescue. One analyst actually told me maybe it's some type of strategy, some PR strategy, trying to pressure Hamas in some way. And that's why the Prime Minister decided to use that language instead of anything else. Maayan, I want to get your quick comment on this. We know these military operations are still ongoing. We have about a minute and a half, by the way, but we're just hearing that the IDF says that they dismantled a massive 3-kilometer tunnel of networks inside of southern Gaza. I mean, they're saying that this stretch 4 kilometers, they were offshoots of each other. And the fact that they're still discovering this, what does that have to say about the situation inside of Gaza?
Well, what it says is exactly what I was implying before. We have done a great tactical job in many ways. Hamas is certainly much weaker than it was before, but that tunnel network, which was several hundred kilometers long, is certainly not done and dismantled. And the fact that they're still discovering tunnels like the one you just described indicates that there is much more work to be done in Gaza. And certainly, again, that Hamas is still operating, weaker, but operating. And it is a risk to the residents, not only of southern Israel, but to Israel at large, and of course, to the region.
Maayan Hoffman, thanks so much for being with us today and for breaking down all these details for us.
Thank you.
And that is a wrap here on ILTV on the hour as we continue to follow all of the developments from Netanyahu planning on going to the United States to meet with President Trump as there is mounting pressure to get a ceasefire and a hostage deal done. In addition, we are following all the updates on that. Thanks so much for joining us. See you soon.